Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, what can you say about the Occupy Wall Street protests?
I don't know.
The media are still trying to figure that out.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
Legal battles in France, allegations of spying on journalists, and the website that got taken down for keeping an eye on the French police. Low-tech propaganda wars between the Koreas, North and South. And why just Photoshop your pictures when you can Photoshop your life? Our web video of the week.
Photoshop your memory.
What do they want? We don't really know. When do they want it? Now. In the first month of the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations, the young movement was depicted in the media as everything from a group of anarchists with no coherent agenda to a global movement comparable to the Arab Spring. Despite some optical similarities between the two, there exists a fundamental difference, one that matters to the media. Journalists were able to define the Arab uprisings by a simple common goal: regime change. The Occupy Wall Street movement and its imitators springing up around the globe have an agenda that is just taking shape, so the coverage is far from straightforward. Our starting point this week could have been Wall Street, but the hashtag has changed and the story has moved. Occupy Wall Street is now Occupy Everything, but the question remains, can their story infiltrate the media in a meaningful way?
Occupy Wall Street movement enters its second month today.
The challenge really is that it's not only a battle of words and messaging, it's also a battle of images.
What we can't see really on television is the mood. So can you help us capture that?
It certainly is very difficult to get the media to cover something when there are no identifiable leaders and platforms.
You know what this movement needs? They need to kind of clarify. They need policy issues. This is what we want.
Where's the authority voice? How do you choreograph it?
What exactly is everybody complaining about?
Who sits on the panel?
What do these people want?
Who's in charge here?
Nobody is. That is both the point and, in terms of news coverage, the problem. The media love a good analogy, preferably a short one.
Many are comparing the rallies to the Arab Spring uprisings in the Middle East.
And they often use analogies, comparing a news story to something that came before, when what they're actually looking for is context. The challenge with the Occupy Wall Street movement and comparisons to the uprisings in the Arab world is that there are more differences than similarities.
The one thing we learned from the Arab uprisings is that we forced our story through the media cycle. We didn't only demand it, but we produced the content and we provided the speakers and we provided a very clear and coherent message.
The uprising has been organized by young, well-educated Egyptians.
And it could be summarized in one statement: the people want to bring down the regime.
Now, you could say about Occupy Wall Street, well, the clue is in the title. You know, the challenge right now is to address very clearly and directly at a simple figurehead, which is corporate financial rule that must be overthrown as it were, as a tyrant. To say that the financial sector, globally organized, is as it were a global tyrant that should be toppled. A single simple message. But there's a reluctance, I think, for the media to convey that.
Tell me what democracy looks like.
Finding a single, simple message in a disparate group of demonstrators is not easy. And when the protests then spread to other countries with other issues, the message becomes less focused.
The European press say that protests in Europe are part of the same movement as the protests in the United States.
The Wall Street occupation has now given birth to a worldwide movement.
You can criticize the American press for not taking the movement seriously enough. The same sort of criticism might be leveled at the European press for instantly seeing it almost as some sort of Marxist uptick in class consciousness or part of a proto-revolution.
There is a simmering animosity at the New York demonstrations toward corporate media in general, and it boils over when crews from right-wing Fox News show up.
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
There are some people who are really inflamed.
I know. What are they angry about?
They just are
I don't know.
You don't know?
If the journalist is ignoring the message, it's because the movement allows him to. It does not speak with one voice, so its message sounds mixed. News outlets have spoken to various people and tried to make leaders for a nascent movement, an assembly that does not really have any.
An assembly, for example, cannot be fitted within the norms of representation in the media. The first thing you do is you look for someone with authority to speak. Now, an assembly doesn't really work like that. It doesn't generate spokespeople with that kind of legitimacy. The media, that's not what they're looking for. They're looking for preferably someone charismatic, perhaps, or preferably someone who has some sort of theatrical value.
New movements don't spring fully formed from nothing. They have to evolve. And so what we've seen in terms of the media coverage of Occupy Wall Street is that at the beginning people didn't really understand what it was, and I think most of the protesters, in fact, didn't have a clear idea of exactly what it was they were trying to achieve or what it was they were trying to say.
In the Arab uprisings, you had a class of activists that has been domestically grown and trained over a decade and who are basically cumulatively gaining experience by the day. Whereas in the Occupy Wall Street movement, you have basically people who spontaneously hit the streets. And the organizers didn't quite think through their media strategy, and that's costing them right now because they are not being taken quite seriously by their own domestic media. Now, global media is a different story.
En este caso, de Wall Street. Los indignados se han instalado.
They're starting to latch on to this American meme that American journalists and their media have not been covering this sufficiently. The Chinese state-run media has been relatively gleeful, and someone opportunistically said that this is a case of American journalists being really quick to jump on mass protests in other countries, but not in their own.
To be fair to the U.S. media, the Wall Street demonstrations have failed to provide them with the kind of images that drove news coverage of the Arab Spring. Throngs of people often battling embattled authorities. Like it or not, the sights and sounds of conflict are essential news ingredients, whether the story is social, economic, or political.
There's more attention generated in American media around the ongoing Republican primary campaign than there has been around Occupy Wall Street.
And we've got Herman Cain, who's joining us from Harriman, Tennessee.
The challenge for the organizers of the Occupy Wall Street movement is to articulate more savvy talking points that fit in the concerns of mainstream America in order to get the kind of attention that they seek to get.
One final point, a counterpoint, to the argument that the absence of a single goal, such as regime change, hampers a movement like Occupy Wall Street, which seeks a systemic change, not just a political one. Since the fall of Hosni Mubarak, protesters have been back on the streets of Cairo, clashing with security forces and more recently fighting for fair coverage on state-run television. Egyptians have turfed out a leader, but they have yet to change the system. In that respect, the two movements in the Arab world and the one that started in America are analogous after all. Our Global Village voices now on the media and its handling of the Occupy Wall Street story.
The problem with the mainstream media's coverage of the Occupy movement is that they are the problem. I mean, they like to pretend that they're confused, that they don't understand who we are, that we need to define ourselves. But the truth is, they know exactly who we are and exactly why we are there. They are simply afraid of losing control of the conversation, terrified of anything like complexity, and quite frankly, afraid of losing their jobs.
There's been criticism that the Occupy Wall Street protests lack specific goals. With the Tea Party protests, it was obvious what they wanted: less government, lower taxes. It's harder to summarize the Occupy Wall Street protests in a soundbite, and I think that's making the media's job a bit more difficult.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. A conflict between the Sarkozy government and France's biggest newspaper, Le Monde, has resulted in the head of the French spy agency being the subject of an official court investigation. Bernard Squarcini, who's nicknamed the Shark, is accused of illegally spying on Le Monde journalist Gérard Davet by obtaining his phone records. Davet was working on a story known as L'Affaire Bettencourt, a scandal involving illegal donations to President Sarkozy's 2007 election campaign. We've looked at this story before and the ongoing battle between Sarkozy and Le Monde. Sarkozy cannot be forced to testify in this case, however, because of a law that grants him immunity. Last year, another investigative publication in France, Le Canard Enchaîné, alleged that Sarkozy personally supervised the surveillance of French journalists covering sensitive stories. The Élysée Palace has denied that. Another French court has sided with the Sarkozy government by blocking access to a website that documents acts of violence and abuse by police officers. The website, called Copwatch Nord Paris EDF, featured videos allegedly showing police wrongdoing in the arresting of suspects, the taunting of protesters, as well as acts of violence against ethnic minorities. Police complained that having their pictures and, in some cases, personal data on the site put them at risk. Their case was taken up by the Interior Minister, Claude Gouin, who took it to court. Similar websites in the U.S. have survived court challenges there, protected by free speech guarantees in the Constitution. France is different, and a spokesperson for an internet freedom campaign group, La Quadrature du Net, said this court order illustrates an obvious will by the French government to control and censor citizens' new online public spheres. There's a media war brewing between Britain and Iran, and Iran's state-funded English-language news channel, Press TV, is predicting that it will be the casualty. Press TV says it expects to have its license to broadcast in the UK revoked by Britain's broadcasting regulator, Ofcom. Ofcom has already ruled that Press TV breached the terms of its license when it aired a 2009 interview with Iranian-Canadian journalist Maziar Bahari, which occurred while Bahari was in a Tehran prison charged with spying and was, according to Ofcom, in a state of duress. We interviewed Maziar Bahari in 2010. He told us that Press TV and other Iranian channels should not be allowed to freely operate in the United Kingdom as long as Iran continues to block Western channels from broadcasting into its territory. On its website, Press TV made all kinds of accusations about the British government meddling in this case, even suggesting it would be banned as a result of mounting pressure on Ofcom by certain members of the royal family. Coincidentally or not, Iran has recently arrested some Iranian filmmakers working in conjunction with one of the BBC's overseas channels, BBC Persian. The British newspaper The Guardian continues to chip away at Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. The Guardian reports that a News Corp executive has resigned after The Guardian started asking questions about an alleged circulation scam at the Wall Street Journal. Andrew Langhoff was the managing director of Dow Jones & Co., the journal's parent company. The Guardian has published what it described as evidence alleging that the European edition of the paper channeled funds to companies to buy its newspapers and falsify circulation figures. The story did not go down well with the Wall Street Journal, which said the Guardian's inflammatory characterization of the Wall Street Journal's circulation program is replete with untruths and malign interpretations. Andrew Langhoff resigned because of a perceived breach of editorial integrity, not because of circulation programs. News Corp has had it up to here with The Guardian and its reporter Nick Davis. Davis broke this story as well as most of the phone hacking revelations over the past 3 years. He's now writing a book on phone hacking and plans to move to the United States in order to follow the legal case against News Corp as it makes its way through the American courts. North and South Korea's uneasy ceasefire has held for most of the past 60 years. However, since the shelling of a South Korean island and the sinking of a battleship last year, a new war of words has erupted across the 38th parallel. For most of the past decade, South Korea has sought to appease North Korea with what it calls its sunshine policy, an attempt to cool down the rhetoric coming out of Pyongyang. Part of that policy was an agreement not to stir up dissent in the North through radio broadcasts coming from the South. But that policy has started to unravel. The South is now turning a blind eye to independent activists who want to turn the North's own population against its leaders. The Listening Post's Simon Ostrovsky now from the border that divides the Korean peninsula.
How do you get a message into a country that has no internet, where international phone calls are banned, and where carrying a pocket radio could land you in prison? Lee Min-bok is a North Korean defector and a Christian missionary who thinks he has the answer.
Because North Korea is the only country that doesn't have internet or radio, we should tell them the truth about the outside world, because they're fooled by lies. This will hopefully lead to some changes.
He's taking part in an activity that has led the North to threaten military action against South Korea, and which just a few months ago was considered by the South Korean authorities to be an illegal activity. He's sending balloons across the world's most fortified frontier. Launching balloons into North Korea isn't an exact science, but the Christian activist sending this balloon up into the sky today hopes that the wind will carry it a few miles across the North Korean border, where it'll shower down thousands of leaflets onto North Korean territory, and where hopefully ordinary North Koreans will be able to pick them up and get some news from the outside world. The leaflets Lee sends into North Korea contain a mixture of news of world events, Christian teachings, and information countering the narrative that's elevated North Korea's leader Kim Jong-il to the level of a living god. Two plainclothes South Korean policemen shadow him daily. He says to protect him from a possible assassination attempt by North Korean agents. In recent months, South Korea has ramped up its rhetoric against the North, departing from a long-standing policy of engagement and allowing activists like Lee free rein to provoke the rage of the authorities in Pyongyang. This, the South says, is the reason for the shift. A warship sunk, the island of Yeonpyeong shelled, and 50 South Koreans killed in attacks from the North last year that led the government in Seoul to end its truce in the information war.
In these circumstances, the government decided that the agreement to no longer send news across the border, signed in 2004, is no longer valid.
That may be the South's official position, but in reality, most of the information meant to foment revolt against the regime of Kim Jong-il is still being generated by North Korean defector groups, not the government itself. Park Sang-hak is another North Korean who regularly sends balloons across the border. He said he was using news of the revolts in the Arab world to try to encourage dissent in his homeland.
It talks about these dictators. Mubarak is gone. Gaddafi is gone. And why the Jasmine Revolution is happening in North Africa. These are the realities we're trying to convey to the North Koreans, because they have no idea.
In the North, reading anything but official sources of information is an offense punishable by long prison sentences. So Park said he often stuffs his low-tech leaflet bombs with $1 bills to encourage impoverished North Koreans to risk picking them up. He also sends small radio sets, banned in North Korea, up with the balloons, so that those who find them can tune into radio broadcasts from the South. This is the border with North Korea, and it's one of the most militarized frontiers in the entire world. And although it's remained relatively peaceful since the Korean War, the airwaves above me are buzzing with competing radio signals from both the North and the South. But not all of the signals get through. North Korea protects its airspace from South Korean broadcasts with powerful jamming towers.
This is a jamming tower of North Korea designed to block out any and all kinds of signals from South Korea, including their satellite TVs, or Wi-Fi's, or many other radio signals.
It's not just North Korea that's trying to shield its citizens from the ideology of its foe. Viewing North Korean television broadcasts like this one, or reading their newspapers in South Korea, is only legal in the National Library. If you try to access these same materials on the internet, you're likely to encounter a message like this one from the cyber police, who block about 60 North Korea-related websites. Restrictions on North Korean materials are so tight in South Korea that when I tried to get copies made from this North Korean book in an ordinary copy shop... Can you make a copy of this book here?
No copy.
Why not? The manager refused to handle it. We can't copy this? At the Unification Ministry, I was told North Korean materials are banned to protect South Korean citizens from North Korean disinformation.
The reason is that the real situation in North Korea is not reflected accurately in their internet sites, and most of it is political agitation.
South Koreans are some of the best educated and most internet-savvy people on Earth, which has led to questions about the necessity of restrictions on content that is obvious propaganda. One of the people questioning the regulations is Tae Kyung-ha, the editor of Open Radio for North Korea, which is one of a handful of defector broadcasters trying to break through North Korea's jamming technology.
This policy is ridiculous because, you know, we are a free country and people are quite civilized to tell which is right and which is wrong. For the South Korean government, they view it as a kind of reciprocity measures.
It's not just North Korea that wants to stop defectors sending their missives from the South. Some South Koreans wish they would stop too.
We oppose the dispersal of the leaflets because it's the same as shooting and launching missiles. Plotting against the North Korean leader and the government by sending leaflets is a psychological form of warfare.
That kind of warfare has been waged for more than 60 years on this peninsula, with the North jamming every South Korean signal it can and the South not trusting its own citizens' ability to handle crude propaganda from the North. And operating far from the airwaves and well below the radar, the defectors prodding Pyongyang, one balloon at a time.
More Global Village Voices now on the media and the tale of the two Koreas.
Due to the extreme proximity of the North Korean military threat, I believe it's quite understandable that the South Korean government is very vigilant about what communications it allows its own people to view from the North. On the other hand, one of the problems we see is that often the information about the humanitarian crisis, which is so serious in North Korea, is often filtered out from the South Korean population.
There's no doubt on North Korea's intention to engage in this kind of cyber warfare since two Koreas remain technically at war. What worries South Koreans is the political side taking advantage of the situation. Many criticize South Korean government for using this as a chance to justify their online censorship.
The ultimate goal of this information blockade is mostly used to prevent each party from knowing too much about one another. I think both countries have different reasons for this information blockade, but in the end it just clashes against one another and does not facilitate relationships.
Finally, Rhett and Link are a comedy duo we've featured before here at The Listening Post. They made their name on the net. They call themselves entertainers. They've since made the jump to mainstream media with a new show on the American channel IFC. Rhett and Link also write songs. This one's about photoshopping, which is digital slang for the editing of photographs. Now, when you're watching this, keep in mind, our web video of the week contains no real special effects, just some photoshopping and jump cuts. We don't have time to show you the whole thing, but we'll post a link to the entire video on our Facebook page. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Your birthday this past Monday was a fun day, except for one thing. Your mother-in-law, who makes your skin crawl, stuck her face in every frame. You'd prefer to remember that day without her tattooed brows. The simplest solution: decrease the resolution and crop that woman out. Photoshop your but you can be who you want people to think you are.